And this morning we are in chapter 16. So if you would turn there, Craig is going to come and read it for us.
Chapter 16, Matthew. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, "When evening comes, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red.' And in the morning, 'Today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast.' You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Jesus left them and went away. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and said, "It is because we didn't bring any bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the right hands of the elders, the chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
Thank you, Craig. I struggle with this passage. It isn't that I try to have a problem with every passage. It isn't that I try to see things differently. It just happens. But I was struggling with the last part of this passage because the part where Jesus says, "Take up your cross," and if you're not worthy to be a disciple unless you're willing to, take up your cross and be crucified and follow me. And it sounds so much like a works salvation. It sounds so much like those Hindus that thrash themselves on the back so that God will love them. It sounds, I was struggling with it. So I started studying some of the words that were being used and some of the phrases, and oddly, I came up with a different conclusion as to what Jesus was saying. The first thing that I discovered is the word cross, and my conviction is that that's mistranslated. Because we translate it cross, and we associate cross with the crucifixion. The word actually means stake, and it was used in a number of different ways in that day and age. And in reality, crucifixion is not something which would have been normal for the average person. No one really expected to die by crucifixion. So for Jesus to say, take up your cross of crucifixion, just sounds sort of unusual, I think. But one way in which the word was used was in the way in which people who had done a community offense or had offended someone, they would be tied to a stake. You know, like you have pictures of those people who were in the stocks. It was similar to that. It was the same exact word. So what I sort of think Jesus is saying is take up those things which are hindering you from God. I don't think that he's saying take up a cross and be crucified for me. I think what he is saying is you need to give up what is closest and dearest to you. And the reality is that all of us have sort of figured out life. We all have an idea of what life is all about, and we have it in this nice little neat box. And if it fits in the box, we're comfortable with it. If it's outside of the box, we're uncomfortable with it. And I think what Jesus is saying is, you know what? You need to let that box go. You need to allow me to be something different than you perhaps imagine me to be. If you truly want to follow me, it's going to cause you to stretch. He's not in any way saying that there's some works involved on our part, but he is saying there is a mental effort that needs to happen. There needs to be some freedom, some flexibility to see God in ways and to see life in ways that we're not seeing them. One of the great hindrances to this happening is shame. Shame hinders us in so many ways, and let me just read you a couple things about shame. And I want to sort of look at this passage in light of that. I know that there's a lot of different ways that you can study a passage and you can look at it, but I want to kind of look at it from the context and the perspective of shame. Shame is something which I believe began in the garden experience with Adam and Eve. And when we first, as humans, rejected God, the immediate result was that we felt shame. And when God came to them, he says, what's going on? And they had covered themselves with leaves because they were embarrassed of themselves. They were embarrassed of who they were suddenly. It was the first time that they'd experienced anything like that. And so shame came into our existence, and I think that shame has been perpetuated. And it's something that we, in fact, perpetuate. Shame on you for doing that. You should be ashamed of yourself. And we do it as a method of control and a method of keeping people in, perhaps, our little box. But the roots of shame really go clear back to our rebellion against God. Brene Brown wrote a book. In fact, I think in Sunday school we watched some of her videos about shame, and she says it's an intense, painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. We often experience shame when we are entangled in a web of layered, conflicting, and competing social community expectations. Shame creates feelings of fear, blame, and disconnection. I was reading a blog about this, and she said, I felt this intense feeling of unworthiness throughout my life. I felt shame about not knowing certain authors, books, politicians that I should know. I felt shame in school when I didn't know an answer, when I didn't get perfect grades, or when I sang out of tune. I felt shame about my body and not being thin or pretty enough. I felt shame about being anxious and having a panic attack or two. In elementary and middle school, I felt shame about my dad's thick Russian accent. When I was around 8, I felt shame when my grandma started counting out her pennies, dimes, and nickels for my double brownie scoop at Baskin-Robbins and barely had enough. Shame is such a part of us. We feel shame when we express emotions, or maybe perhaps when we don't express emotions. When we don't wear the right clothes, we look around and we feel like we're not dressed exactly appropriately. When we don't say the right things, or when we say the wrong things. When we are required to speak, or when we shouldn't speak. Shame just comes into our life so many different ways. Some of our childish behaviors are still a part of shame in our life. This past week, I was with some of my most favorite people in the world, the pastors that I get together with every week and pray together. And I was wrestling with this passage, and so I just pitched my frustration out to them. I said, I'm kind of struggling with this passage. What do you think Jesus is talking about? And they gave me mostly the answers that I expected them to give me. And they suggested some good commentaries I might go to and some other ideas, which I appreciated. But as I left there, as I was driving home, I had this sense of shame. I thought, oh man, I wish I hadn't brought that up. They think I don't have any good books. They think I don't know how to study a passage. I just feel horrible. I feel really badly. I feel so ashamed that I brought that up. I worked through it and I realized that it was shame. A number of years ago, probably about a decade ago, I did a ride-on with an officer in King County on a Friday evening. I was in for 4 hours, and we were cruising around and pulling people over for taillights out and stuff. Real exciting, but we just had a really enjoyable evening. And during the course of the evening, he was sharing that he'd really been struggling with finding a church and some of his frustrations and things. Well, 2 days later, on Sunday morning, he shows up on here with his wife and another couple who were their friends with. And I didn't recognize him. I went up and greeted him as if I'd never seen him before. And it wasn't until the next day that I realized what I had done. And I remembered the look on his face when I walked up to him to introduce myself to this guest. I still feel immense shame about that. I have really poor facial recognition, and it's really hard for me to remember people by looking at them. But that doesn't excuse the shame I feel. And I don't even know his name. There's just no way I can even track him down. Incredible shame that I feel over that. Embarrassment. It never came back. When I was in 6th grade, actually when I was in 5th grade, I think I've told you some of you this story before, but I had a friend whose name was Robert Morris. Same last name as mine. And he was an odd-looking kid with big ears and awkward and wore ragged clothes and didn't always smell the best. And I befriended him. And we were friends all 5th grade. 6th grade, I remember the first day of school, and I had decided I'm not going to be Robert's friend this year because it was costly to be Robert's friend. People made fun of me as well, and people wouldn't hang out with me because I was hanging out with Robert. I'll never forget that day, first day of school, when Robert saw me and ran over with a big smile on his face, and I said, I don't want to be your friend this year. That's not the worst part of the story. I didn't hang out with Robert all that year. and never saw him again. And I heard years later that next summer he committed suicide. Can you imagine the shame that I feel over that? I recognize that I was a child. I was in 6th grade. I mean, what do you expect of 6th graders? But, just to have been his friend, that year might have saved his life. I've wondered if God in his peculiar grace, one of my dear friends' name is Robert Morris, who pastors at Hobart Community, same name. And I wondered if somehow God brought that all together to remind me that I'm not guilty, but the shame is still there. So what do you do with the shame in your life? What does the Bible say about it? Well, I want to look at some ways that shame affects us in this chapter. The first thing that happens is that the scribes and Pharisees come to Jesus, and I can imagine that they are functioning in this box of society, and they're really uncomfortable with anything that's outside of this box. In a sense, that box is created by shame. And they're trying to do everything they can to keep the box stable. And Jesus is constantly thwarting the box, and constantly making them uncomfortable, and constantly making them feel like it's not the way it's supposed to be. And they constantly want to project shame upon him. They don't want to feel shame. They want him to experience shame. You need to get into the box. You're not fitting in here correctly. And a lot of people struggle with God because he doesn't exactly fit into the box the way he's supposed to. Why isn't he rescuing the people that are poor and oppressed? Why isn't he saving children? He's not fitting into my little box. I'm kind of embarrassed about God. Some of the stories the Bible tells about it, he's a little embarrassing to me. I'm ashamed of him. The other issue here is an issue of our mind, and we live in a society that worships the mind and worships science. I mean, there's nothing more popular right now than science and what science is doing, and we trust in science. Science is going to provide He's going to come up with a cure for cancer. Science is going to get us to into outer space. We trust that science will figure out what all the problems are between societies. Scientists are writing that if we could just simply get rid of religion, we wouldn't have any wars anymore. So science is the answer right now. And they want a sign. They want a scientific sign. And some people want God to give them a sign. A scientific explanation as to why he exists. And we say, well, there's lots of design. There's lots of ways God shows us. Yeah, we want more. We want angels to appear because that will fit into our little scientific box. And I appreciate the mind. I love my mind. I love science. But there is a time where faith takes precedent over science and over our minds. We have to give up the cross. We have to give up that dependence upon science at some point and say, God, it's through faith that I'm going to trust in you. And then we come to the disciples. Jesus is talking to them about bread, and what happens? They're ashamed. They forgot to bring any. We didn't do what we were supposed to do. It was our responsibility to do this, and we didn't do it, and so they feel shame. And Jesus says, it's not about that. You're missing the point. It's not about that. It's about the box. It's exactly the opposite of what you're saying. It's stretching yourself outside of the box and allowing yourself to see me differently than what I am. Then comes some explanations, and Jesus says, who do you think that I am? Well, again, carefully conscripted answers. Let's see, what are people saying? What can I say that wouldn't be embarrassing or cause me to look bad? I don't want to give the wrong answer. This is Jesus, for crying out loud. I don't want to give him the wrong answer. Well, some people are saying that you might be Elijah. Some people are saying that you might be John the Baptist. And he says, yeah, I know what they're saying. What do you say? Silence. Except for Peter. He says, I think you're the Messiah. And Jesus says, "Blessed are you, because it wasn't revealed to you from the box. It was revealed to you outside of the box. And you accepted it by faith. You stepped out, you stretched yourself. You're willing to accept the shame of acknowledging me." So, how do we deal with shame in our life? Well, interestingly enough, he goes on to talk about the keys to the kingdom there, and understand that when Jesus is giving this discourse to his disciples, he's standing in Caesarea Philippi, which is to the north and the east of Galilee. And Caesarea Philippi was a Roman city, and they had a huge temple there to the god Pan, who was the god of the underworld, and there was actually a cave there, and the cave went way down into the ground, and people had gone down there and not come back. So they presumed that this was an entrance to hell.